Hello and welcome to the New South for the New Southerner. I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm a community historian here in Charlotte, New York. Charlotte, North Carolina, and helping out this evening with the Levine Museum of the New South of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library. This series, The New South for the New Southerner, is something that Levine Museum of the New South has been doing for more than a decade. We are a city of newcomers. The Museum of the New South looks at the South since the Civil War, as this region has reinvented itself and reinvented itself and reinvented itself. And it is a city of newcomers where folks are really hungry for history. So that is what Levine Museum of the New South does in its online events, in the exhibits that are not open right at the moment because of the COVID quarantine, and in this ongoing series, The New South for the New Southerner. Tonight, the subject is Women Vote. Today is literally the 100th anniversary of Congress ratifying the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, in which women won the right to vote. And so we'll hear about that story tonight from folks at the League of Women Voters. Let me thank our sponsors, the Arts and Science Council, which does so much for arts, culture, and history in Charlotte, the National Humanities Council, and the North Carolina Humanities Council, and the good folks at Mertz Heart and Soul. If we were here gathering live, we'd have green beans and cornbread and fried chicken, but just have to take some takeout the next time you're down in the Center City. So with that, thanks very much to Alex Pineras at Levine Museum of the New South, who's running our technology, and to Tom Cole and Martha Yesowich, who have set things up at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library. I'd like to bring on screen, if I may, Hannah Terrell to tell you a little bit about the series of events that Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library is doing right now as part of this effort to commemorate the 19th Amendment. Go ahead and unmute yourself so that folks can hear you. Welcome, Hannah Terrell.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. We're not in New York, Tom?
I grew up in New York. Every once in a while when I get nervous, I think I'm still there.
That's okay. Thank you so much to you, Tom, for moderating today. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in tonight. And we just want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library and our Engage 2020 team. And our Engage 2020 initiative, Look Back, Move Forward, is an important project that was birthed out of a partnership between the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library and the Digital Public Library of America. And it's with the support of Pivotal Ventures, which is a Melinda Gates company. And the DPLA, they are a leader in digital education, and they sought to build a collaborative collection that was focused on the roles of Black women in the women's suffrage movement. And we know and appreciate the early work of our women's suffragists of Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Stanton. But we're charged, Tom and our viewers, to elevate the narrative of the work of Black women and the significant role that they played in this movement. And so those of Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, and so many others. And today, as you've mentioned, Tom, it is actually the 100-year celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment that granted women the right to vote. And that was one of the primary inspirations for this project. And we are focused on that and beyond. So to find out more about the types of programs like tonight and how you can get engaged in them and even other resources, please frequently visit our website at cmlibrary.org/engage2020. And you will not be disappointed at all of the resources that we have there, the historical stories of local women, as well as our national figures. So please go to our website frequently to find out more.
Thank you so much, Hannah Terrell from Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. Coming up at the end of our time together, we're going to have about a 40-minute presentation from Reagan Aduddle with League of Women Voters, and then Carolyn Lyons from League of Women Voters will join us, as well as Dr. Tom Cole, who is one of the reference historians at the Carolina Room of the Uptown Public Library. We'll show you their website in a little bit, but I'll give you a hint that it's cmstory.org, a great place to find out Charlotte area history. And so we'll have a discussion toward the end. There is a chat function here on your screen. See if you can find that. And if you have questions, comments, things to add, things to dispute, go ahead and let us know. And I will try and bring those to everyone to respond to when we get to the end here. So let's bring Reagan Aduddle up from League of Women Voters. Say just a word really quickly about what the League is.
Well, we are a nonpartisan organization, and we are focused on empowering the voter, empowering people to vote. We support issues, not candidates. And the League was actually founded 100 years ago. After we were ratified, we became from fighting for ratification to helping people learn to vote, to support different issues.
And it is an amazing thing. The advertisement for this effort is a parade down Tryon Street where suffrage activists were carrying a banner that says "Votes for Women." That banner is on display at Levine Museum of the New South, and it was put there by the League of Women Voters. I hadn't realized that absolute direct connection.
Yes.
By the way, if you are, like myself, not a woman, and you wonder, can I join the League of Women Voters? Yes, you can. I have done that, and it's an educational thing. Great folks connecting us with our American democratic institutions. Talk a little bit about the slides that we're going to see here. This started out as just an ordinary PowerPoint, and then it's gotten fancier.
We were asked by CPCC actually to do a presentation on the upcoming 100th, ratification, or the 19th Amendment ratification, and we thought, oh, sure, we can do this. We're the League. And as we started researching, we started realizing how much these women went through, how long it took, how it started working with the abolitionists. And it was a really interesting thing to learn. It was very exciting to do. And we presented this as a PowerPoint in March. It was March 3rd, which was primary day. And I believe the 107th anniversary of Alice Paul's parade down in Washington, D.C., the first big parade, or one of the biggest parades. And unfortunately, we kind of know the story. We got shut down, and we were unable to continue presenting our PowerPoint talk. And we thought, oh, we would hate to let this go. And we were able to put this onto a slide, or a more of a video, with the help of Charles and Mary Love, who are also members. And they did a great job helping us do this so that we can continue to let people know what happened, this long, hard struggle for women to get the right to vote. And we continue to struggle today.
Who could ever believe that women were not allowed to vote? They were not. And this story takes you from the beginnings of the organizing, which are fascinating because they're wound up in the abolitionist movement. And you will meet Black and white women who were abolitionists, who were very much activists. And as it unwound, around minute 29, that's when North Carolina and Charlotte get into it. North Carolina, not surprisingly, was a little bit reluctant. North Carolina, Tennessee were among the last states to consider ratifying. Many of you know that story. I'd forgotten the story about the letter from the mama. There's
Yes.
a letter from the mama that makes a big difference, so be watching for that. And then the last few minutes look at unfinished business 100 years ago, finishing things we're still finishing today, things we're still fighting over, like the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So this is a national story. There'll be some local parts to it and state parts to it. And like I say, get on your chat if you would, ask us questions, make comments, and we'll bring those to you in a discussion at the end. All righty, I think I've done all the things I'm supposed to do. Reagan, just say a couple of words and Alex Panaris will roll the video.
All right, well, this is our presentation of the 72 years for the fight for women to get the right to vote. And it does not end in 1920, but we continue on. But this is the beginning.
Thank you.
"2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, granting American women the right to vote. A direct descendant of the suffrage movement, the League of Women Voters also celebrates its centennial year. The suffrage movement was one of America's largest civil rights movements, affecting half the population and inspiring many other groups in its quest for enfranchisement and civil rights. Women agitating for the right to vote in the 19th and early 20th century were known as suffragists, and the more militant activists were known as suffragettes. In the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, the fall of many empires and the rise of nation-states across the globe, women in many countries began to demand the right to have a say in the governance of their daily lives and the lives of their families. The American women's suffrage movement is generally agreed to have started in 1848 at the first Women's Right Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. However, women were asking for equal representation long before that. In 1776, as John Adams was attending the First Continental Congress, his wife Abigail Adams wrote to him, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Women were always an important part of the movement to abolish slavery in and beyond the United States. British and American women began writing abolitionist essays in the 1820s. Abolitionists Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were some of the earliest proponents of women's equal rights and women's suffrage. Over time, they would prioritize suffrage, seeing it as the single fundamental cure for the many legal and social ills experienced by the American woman. Mott and Stanton met at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840. At this large meeting of largely British, North American, and European abolitionists, there was a disagreement about whether or not to permit the participation of women. Although women served as delegates, they were denied the opportunity to take part in the proceedings, and they were obligated to watch silently from the spectator galleries. This unfair treatment made a lasting impression on Stanton and Mott, and led to Stanton's decision to hold a women's right convention 8 years later in the United States in Seneca Falls, New York. Organized by Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Martha Coffin Wright, the 1848 convention, now known as the Seneca Falls Convention, was called to discuss civil, social, and religious issues facing women at the time. Using the Declaration of Independence as a guide, Stanton authored a Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which included, among other things, the right of women to vote. The franchise for women was the only cause of dissension at the convention, but ultimately, all members of the convention signed the declaration. One of the signers was then 19-year-old Charlotte Woodward Pierce. the only surviving member of the convention to live to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. Susan B. Anthony did not attend the Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Anthony and Stanton met at a temperance convention in 1851. Thereafter, they collaborated closely in both the abolitionist and the women's suffrage movements, maintaining a close friendship throughout the rest of their lives. Together, they wrote, spoke, organized petitions, and raised funds to support the suffrage cause. The two women were a perfect partnership. Stanton provided the ideas, rhetoric, and strategy. Anthony delivered the speeches, circulated petitions, and rented the halls. Stanton herself once stated, "I forged the thunderbolts, and she fired them." Lucy Stone was another key figure in the early suffrage movement. The first female college graduate in Massachusetts, she earned a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College in 1847. Subsequently, she embarked on a career in public speaking, writing, and publishing about women's rights and suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that Lucy Stone was the first person by whom the heart of the American public was deeply stirred on the woman question. Collectively, Anthony, Stanton, and Stone have been called the 19th century triumvirate of women's suffrage and feminism. Sojourner Truth was an important figure in the suffrage movement. She was born a slave, and when freed, she became a traveling speaker who gained national renown lecturing on the rights of women and slaves. To support herself, she sold small photographic copies of herself captioned, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." It was at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851 that she delivered her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, which emphasized that Black women must be included in the discussions of women's rights. All major movements seeking social change require money and publicity, something Sojourner Truth understood. The suffrage movement initially began as a grassroots movement, employed a wide variety of tactics to raise funds to spread their message. One early fundraising effort was the Women's Suffrage Cookbook. It was developed for and sold at events in Boston, Massachusetts in the late 1800s. Filled with contributions from famous people such as Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, it communicated with women of all classes in the common language of the cookbook about not only food and domesticity, but also the radical cause of women's right to vote. The cookbook served as a strategic rebuttal to the snide jokes and hurtful innuendos directed against the suffragist. They were painted as neglectful mothers and kitchen-hating harridans, busy politicking while their children starved. Later, at the turn of the century, there was an influx of money into the movement provided by wealthy women philanthropists. These women, both Black and white, were famous society grandes dames and businesswomen of the Gilded Age. With their support, the suffrage movement became a major lobbying force, a well-funded organization with money on the order of what the major political parties had to spend. These assets were put to use to underwrite travel, staff, printing, lobbying, parades, and pageants with the aim of influencing public sentiment in the legislature. The partnership between the women's suffrage and the abolitionist movement changed in the era of Reconstruction. 3 constitutional amendments affecting slaves were ratified at the end of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship, equal civic and legal rights, and equal protections under the law to African Americans and emancipated slaves. The 15th Amendment stated that the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 14th Amendment specifically mentioned the word male when discussing voting rights, which caused concern within the suffrage movement. The proposed 15th Amendment, which would specifically enfranchise African American men, caused the split in the women's suffrage movement. At the 1869 meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, the suffrage association Stanton and Anthony founded after the signing of the 13th Amendment, member Frederick Douglass, an ardent supporter of women's suffrage, nevertheless pushed for the passage of the 15th Amendment, arguing that this was the Negro's hour. Anthony and Stanton were opposed to this stance. They wanted to advocate for suffrage for all or none. Stone and other abolitionists felt the wording was fine, and that once African American men had suffrage, women would follow. Susan B. Anthony was quoted as saying, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I ever work for or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." The American Equal Rights Association dissolved after this convention. Stanton and Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which advocated for a federal amendment guaranteeing universal suffrage. Stone, Blackwell, and Julia Howe formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, which worked towards suffrage at the state level. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony tried to vote despite the law. She and several companions registered to vote after convincing the election officials in Rochester, New York, that the 14th Amendment gave all U.S. citizens the right to vote. 4 days after registering, the women cast votes on Election Day, and 13 days after that, Anthony was arrested for illegally voting. Her subsequent court trial was followed by the national press, bringing wide publicity to the suffrage cause. The judge in the case did not allow the jurors to discuss the case and directed them to find Anthony guilty. After being allowed to make a statement of protest to the court, she was fined $100. She responded that she had no intention of paying the fine, and she never did. In 1887, suffragists seeking the possible 16th constitutional amendment for women's suffrage were disappointed by the Senate's decisive rejection. The two national organizations, the NWSA and the AWSA, decided to reunite and work together towards suffrage on a state-by-state basis. They rebranded as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASWA, and elected Elizabeth Cady Stanton president. However, she acted only as a symbolic head, while Susan B. Anthony ran the organization. Carrie Chapman Catt took over the presidency in 1900 and brought a new drive and supreme organizational ability. Catt promoted her society plan, which entailed enlisting wealthy women, club women, and social leaders to help the cause. In 1914, socialite Miriam Frank Leslie died and bequeathed the bulk of her $2 million estate to Catt to further the women's suffrage cause. Catt sought to promote an air of respectability to the movement and appeal to a much larger constituency. In 1910, the membership was in the millions. The Western U.S. led the way for gains in women's suffrage. The abolition of slavery and the aftermath of the Civil War sparked a national debate about citizenships and voting rights. Serious consideration was being given to the notion that people other than white men could have a say in the democratic society. The West was new territory and could be open to new ways of governing, so pro-suffrage groups began to organize. They formed coalitions with groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Blatch, the Poppies, and the Mormon Church. California's diverse communities supported the cause, and suffrage articles were published in Spanish and other languages. NASWA also provided the on-ground support. Suffragists in Kansas adopted the sunflower state symbol during the 1867 campaign because the flower was strong and withstood adversity. They encouraged followers to wear yellow buttons and pins and sashes to show their support. Together with purple for loyalty and white for purity, these became the American suffragist colors. After decades of work, the movement began to achieve success. Wyoming became the first territory to grant women's suffrage in 1869. Colorado became the first state to grant women's suffrage in 1893. It was the first time supporters had convinced male voters, as opposed to legislatures, to enfranchise women. Montana sent the first woman, Jeanette Rankin, to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1916. As momentum grew and more states enfranchised women, mounting pressure was placed at the national level to support a proposed constitutional amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Initial efforts to persuade men to give women the right to vote centered on an appeal to logic and philosophical arguments. However, as time went on, Some proponents of women's suffrage turned to more militant and aggressive tactics. The British suffrage movement, headed by Emmeline Pankhurst, whose motto was deeds, not words, organized a national bombing and arson campaign. Suffragettes were jailed, held hunger strikes, and were forcibly fed by police. Two young American women studying in England at the time, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, became involved in the British suffrage movement and used similar tactics when they returned to the United States. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women began winning the vote around the globe, and they began to work together on the international level. In 1904, the International Women's Suffrage Alliance was formed by Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, and other leading world feminists. But America, the vanguard of democracy, lagged behind many other countries in legalizing women's suffrage. During the same year, Mary Church Terrell, a prominent leader in the Washington, D.C. African American community, spoke at the International Congress of Women in Berlin. She emphasized that Black women faced both sexism and racism, stating, "However much the white women of the country need suffrage, colored women need it more." Terrell highlighted a central tension within the American suffrage movement. There was little unity between Black and white suffragists and often overt racism within the movement. Although NASWA did not exclude African American women from membership at the national level, state and local organizations could and did choose to exclude them. The women's suffrage movement faced many powerful enemies. Beginning in the early 1900s, real organized opposition emerged. In 1911, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, NAOWS, was formed. Members included many wealthy, influential women, the liquor industry, urban political machines, Southern congressmen, and corporate capitalists. The liquor industry in particular did not want women voting for fear they would support prohibition, and labor leaders did not want women supporting unions or fighting discriminatory labor laws. Anti-suffragists did not always oppose women being involved in public affairs, but rather they argued women should maintain an apolitical stance. Opponents of suffrage had many claims as to why women should be denied enfranchisement, from women being emotionally unstable and intellectually deficit, to voting women would cause a threat to the moral order of the universe. Another often cited reason was women's inability to defend the nation by performing military service. This reason was dispelled with World War I. Despite early successes in the Western U.S., the American suffrage movement entered a period of the doldrums from 1896 to 1910, with few victories and some waning enthusiasm for the cause. It was not reinvigorated until Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, moved back to the U.S. after living in England for 20 years. Blatch was particularly active in mobilizing working-class women while continuing to collaborate with prominent society women. In 1910, Blatch organized the first large-scale suffrage parade in New York City. Today, we are used to the idea of large parades organized to promote social change, but the idea of suffragists marching publicly in the streets was at the time quite a radical proposal. Nevertheless, suffrage parades became a common and effective method of spreading the message in the second decade of the 20th century. When they returned to the U.S. from England, having learned the tactics of civil disobedience from the British militant suffragettes, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns also brought new life to the movement. Paul assumed the leadership of NASWA's congressional committee in charge of working toward a federal suffrage amendment. She and Burns organized the first national suffrage parade on March 3, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. To reinforce the notion of a universal demand for suffrage, women marched in well-identified groups by state or occupation, including teachers, lawyers, actresses, nurses, librarians, and factory workers. Between 5,000 and 8,000 suffragist supporters, 20 floats, 9 bands, and 4 mounted brigades marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in the show of force. College students and mothers, some marching with children and infants, had their own sections, as did men's groups who supported women's suffrage. Bands and floats were included, and participants wore white dresses with purple, gold, and white sashes. Known as the beautiful suffragist, Inez Mulholland was a labor lawyer and social activist. She became the face of the movement by leading the 1913 parade, riding a white horse and wearing a crown and cape. She carried a banner which read, "Forward to the Light." The 1913 parade was not without controversy. When they inquired about joining the parade, the Black women suffragists from Howard University's new Delta Sigma Theta sorority were not welcomed. Alice Paul quietly discouraged their participation, convinced that white women would not march with Black women. Nevertheless, 22 founding members, including Mary Church Terrell, joined the procession. They were told to march at the back of the parade, and they were not listed in the parade program. In 2013, a 100-year anniversary march was held in Washington, D.C., and the group intentionally chosen to lead the procession down Pennsylvania Avenue was Delta Sigma Theta. Ida B. Wells Barnett, the founder of the first Black women's club specifically focused on suffrage, the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, traveled to D.C. to march in the 1913 parade. Wells Barnett was a prominent anti-lynching crusader, journalist, and suffragist. Upon arriving at the parade, she was immediately told as a woman of color to march in the back so as not to upset the Southern delegates. Wells Barnett insisted on marching with her state delegation, stating, "I either go with you or not at all. I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." She waited until the parade began and then walked out from the side of the street to join her state delegation walking down between two white members. No one protested. The 1913 parade was also marred by mob violence, which erupted minutes after the parade began. The crowd broke through the steel cables and spilled into the streets. Men, many of them drunk, spit at the marchers and grabbed at their clothing, hurled insults and lit cigarettes. They snatched banners and tried to climb floats. Police did little to keep order. Observed one of Paul's supporters, "I did not know men could be such fiends." By the end of the day, 100 marchers were taken to the local hospitals. Afterward, Paul used the mistreatment of the marchers to garner public support for the suffrage cause. Marchers pointed out to the media that a government that couldn't protect its female citizens could not properly represent them. Impatient to move more quickly on a federal suffrage amendment, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns broke away from the National American Women's Suffrage Association and formed the National Women's Party in 1914. Unlike NASWA, the NWP favored a high-profile militant tactics and focused solely on pressuring Congress and the president to pass a federal amendment. Meanwhile, at a 1916 NASWA convention, President Carrie Chapman Catt unveiled her winning plan, whereby victory depended upon avoiding detours into states considered hopeless, namely much of the South, while funding more promising state campaigns, lobbying for a federal amendment, and building support for future ratification efforts. Catt appointed Maud Wood Park, a Boston suffragist, to lead NASWA's congressional lobbying effort to gain approval for the 19th Amendment. Park and her subordinates were pioneers in interest group lobbying. They learned tactics to exert political force and were nicknamed the Front Door Lobby by a member of the press gallery journalists because they never used backdoor methods. In 1920, Park became the first president of the National League of Women Voters. Lobbying work was tedious. Keeping track of 435 House representatives and 96 senators was not as glamorous as marching in a parade or picketing, but it was crucial in the campaign to ultimately pass the amendment. In 1916, suffragists from the National Women's Party became the first group to picket in front of the White House. Called the Silent Sentinels because they did not speak, they tried to confront and shame President Woodrow Wilson for his inaction on suffrage. Over the next 2.5 years, thousands of women served as silent sentinels. Lucy Burns led most of the picket demonstrations. In the beginning, the pickets were not bothered, and President Wilson often waved to them as he left the White House. To maintain interest in the press, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns organized groups representing women from different walks of life to picket on different days. For example, teachers or office workers. The pickets stood silently for hours on end, 6 days a week, in all weather. In this photograph, they're standing on heated bricks to stay warm. Once the United States entered World War I, public perception of the pickets changed, and they were viewed as unpatriotic. In June 1917, police began arresting the women outside the White House for obstructing traffic. Tensions reached new heights in August of 1917 after the Sentinels rolled out a banner comparing President Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, with whom we were at war. Angry crowds attacked the pickets and destroyed the banner. In November 1917, pickets began to be arrested and sent to district jails and area workhouses. They were given 6-month sentences. The women considered themselves political prisoners and often undertook hunger strikes. In response, jailers began force-feeding, a painful and humiliating experience. Alice Paul awarded Jailed for Freedom pins to picketers who had served time in jail after the arrests. Arrests at the gates of the White House did nothing to stop the daily gathering of the women picketers. On November 10, 1917, 33 pickets, including Lucy Burns, were arrested and taken to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. The women refused to put on prison uniforms or work, demanding instead to be treated as political prisoners. The prison superintendent called on his guards to teach the women a lesson. Bursting into the room where the women were waiting to be booked, the guards dragged them down the hall and threw them into dark, filthy cells, where they kicked and beat them. Lucy Burns had her hands shackled at the top of the cell, forcing her to stand all night. Another woman was slammed down on the arm of an iron bench. Dora Lewis lost consciousness after her head was smashed into an iron bed. Her cellmate, witnessing the assault, suffered a heart attack and didn't get medical attention till the following morning. After the news reports of hunger strikes, forced feedings, and the Night of Terror reached the public, widespread outrage turned public opinion against the president and the government and in the suffragists' favor. The jailed women were immediately released. The White House was not the only venue for picketing. Demonstrations also took place in nearby Lafayette Park, where in August and September of 1918, the NWP burned copies of Wilson's speeches in which he mentioned the words democracy and freedom. They also burned his portrait in effigy. Fire cauldrons were set up outside the White House in Lafayette Park and kept continuously burning to pressure Wilson to use his influence to secure the remaining votes necessary for Senate passage of the federal amendment. After the U.S. entered World War I in April of 1917, Carrie Chapman Catt and NASWA suspended the active suffrage campaigns and urged women to support the war effort. Thousands of women performed military and aid service in the war. America's first female soldiers, Army Signal Corps telegraph operators nicknamed the Hello Girls, served on the front lines, working the switchboards that linked up the telephones across the front. The Golden 14 were the first female African Americans to serve in the United States Navy. Nicknamed the Yeomanettes, they were petty officers who performed clerical duties in the muster roll department of the Naval Department in Washington. One of the central arguments against female suffrage had been that women were physically unequipped for the duties of citizenship, particularly the obligation to defend the country. But women's wartime service rendered this line of argument ineffective. World War I played a major role in one of the biggest catastrophes in the 20th century. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic was one of the greatest human disasters of all time, infecting 1 in 3 people on Earth and killing between 50 and 100 million people. In the United States, it started in army camps, including Charlotte's Camp Green, and spread around the world due in part to the troop movements. Well over 500,000 people died in the United States. The labor shortage caused by the war and the flu meant that women had to step into roles previously occupied by men. As women contributed more and more to wartime efforts and to the economy, it became harder to justify denying them a voice in the government. The Prison Special was a tour organized in February of 1919. 26 members of the National Women's Party, dressed in their prison uniforms, boarded a chartered train they dubbed Democracy Limited in Washington, D.C. They visited cities across the country where they spoke to large crowds about their incarceration as political prisoners at Occoquan Workhouse. The tour, which concluded in March of 1919, helped create support for the federal women's suffrage amendment. Finally, President Wilson declared his support for the federal amendment, and the U.S. House passed it in May of 1919. 2 weeks later, it passed by the Senate. A perfect 36. 3/4 of the then 48 United States were then needed to officially ratify the amendment. The National Women's Party created a ratification banner to track the progress, and Alice Paul personally sewed a star on the banner after each state ratified the amendment. North Carolina had joined the movement for women's suffrage in 1894 in Asheville with the formation of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association. In 1897, an equal suffrage bill was introduced to the North Carolina State Senate, but the state Senate leader referred it to the committees on the insane asylums, where it died. The state movement then stagnated until 1914, when the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League met in Charlotte for the first time. Goldsboro native Gertrude Wheel was serving as president of the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League when the 19th Amendment passed. Afterwards, she formed the North Carolina League of Women Voters and served as president. In the spring of 1920, 35 of the 36 states needed had ratified the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. North Carolina and Tennessee considered the amendment at the same time. In North Carolina, as in much of the South, the controversy over women's suffrage centered around maintaining white supremacy. They also feared that the amendment would bring increased federal scrutiny of the elections and enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendment. In August of 1920, the North Carolina House sent a telegram to the Tennessee legislature stating that they were voting against the amendment and urged them to do the same. Suffrage supporters persuaded the Tennessee governor to hold a special legislative session in the summer of 1920 to consider the amendment, hoping to win a victory before the November 20 presidential election. Pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage groups made the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville their headquarters and spent the 6 weeks leading up to the vote lobbying for their respective positions. Opponents of ratification wore red roses to show their position, while supporters wore yellow roses. Even lawmakers wore red and yellow roses to indicate their views. Harry T. Byrne was the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature in 1920. A Republican, he initially supported the amendment, but after being pressured by party leaders, he began to side with the anti-ratification side. After much debate, the official vote was at a 48-48 tie, and Byrne subsequently voted to twice table the measure. However, during a final vote, Byrne surprised everyone by voting aye. He had been expected to vote against ratification and was even wearing a red rose. It took a few seconds for the assembly to process his verbal vote. Byrne later publicly indicated that he believed there was a moral and legal right to ratify. Byrne also admitted that he had received a letter from his mother, Feb, urging him to vote yes. Part of the letter read, "Hurrah, and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt." I noticed Chandler's speech. It was very bitter. "I've been watching to see how you stood, but I haven't seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy, and help Mrs. Thomas Cat with her rats. Is she the one that put rat in ratification? Ha! No more from this mama at this time. With lots of love, Mama." Byrne responded to angry anti-ratification parties by inserting a personal statement into the Tennessee House Journal, explaining his decision to cast the vote in part because "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." On August 26, 1920, the Tennessee documents arrived in Washington, D.C., and they were signed by the Secretary of State. Because of one young man's single vote, American women finally won full voting rights. It was the largest expansion of democracy in American history. The popular vote rose from 18.5 million to 26.8 million. Since that day, August 26 has been celebrated as Women's Equality Day. Following 1920, all remaining United States eventually ratified the 19th Amendment. North Carolina did not do so until 1971. At the National Women's Party headquarters in Washington, D.C., Alice Paul and her staff celebrated Tennessee's ratification of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment by unfurling their ratification banner over the balcony. After ratification, women had a variety of experiences and emotion when exercising their new rights. Some were positive and some were not. Some anti-suffrage activists refused to vote. It took many years before as many women as men took part in general elections. While the 19th Amendment was a huge victory for many American women, it is important to remember that it had its limitations and that the fight for full voting rights for all women did not end in 1920. Many federal and state statutes disenfranchised African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. In 1924, partly to recognize the service of the Native Americans in World War I, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Native Citizenship Act into law. Nevertheless, it took over 40 years for all 50 states to allow Native Americans to vote. Dr. Mabel Ping Hua Lee was an active suffragist marching in the 1912 New York City parade. She advocated for the right for women to vote, even though the Chinese were not granted citizenship and the right to vote until 1943. In the South, Jim Crow laws were enacted which required citizens to pass literacy tests and pay poll taxes before they could vote. Violence and intimidation at the polls effectively disenfranchised many men and women of color. It took years of protest, economic boycotts, sit-ins and marches by civil rights leaders and activists to break those barriers. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act, which banned segregation in public places and employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, was signed into law. In March of 1965, peaceful protesters in Alabama organized marches to demand equal access to the polls. On the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, they were met by police armed with tear gas, dogs, and rubber hoses. Amelia Boynton, matriarch of the voting rights movement, was beaten unconscious. These events, which became known as Bloody Sunday, were captured by the media, which in turn galvanized widespread support for voter legislation reform. In August 1965, the Voting Rights Act, designed to put a stop to discriminatory voting requirements and practices, was signed into law. By the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered. Further extensions of the Voting Rights Act in 1975 included requiring bilingual ballots and voting materials in certain regions, making it easier for Latinos to vote. The 26th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1971 and lowered the minimum voting age from 21 to 18. Currently, some activists are advocating lowering the voting age to 16. Persons with disabilities, nearly 1 in 5 Americans, are considered to be one of the most disenfranchised groups within American society. Several key pieces of legislation have passed to help eliminate the disenfranchisement of this population. Within the Voting Rights Act, it is stated that citizens affected by blindness or the inability to read or write will be assigned a person to help them cast their vote. Americans with Disabilities Act mandates accessibility to polling places. Despite these and other legislative efforts, the Federal Elections Commission reports that thousands of polling places throughout the country are still not fully compliant. The National Women's Party remained intact after the passage of the 19th Amendment and turned its attention toward another proposed amendment to the Constitution. Alice Paul did not believe the 19th Amendment would be enough to ensure men and women were treated equally, and in 1923 she introduced the Lucretia Mott Amendment, which was later renamed the Alice Paul Amendment. Today, we know it as the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. Congress approved the amendment in 1972 and sent it to the states with a 7-year time limit for ratification. In January 2020, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the ERA, fulfilling the 3/4 requirement, albeit after the deadline. Current efforts are underway in Congress to remove the original deadline for ratification and make the ERA the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The National American Women's Suffrage Association underwent a transition with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Carrie Chapman Catt proposed the formation of an organization to aid the newly enfranchised women to engage in the political process. The League of Women Voters was organized 6 months prior to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Maud Wood Park became the first national president to the League of Women Voters. Today, the League boasts over 500,000 members, both men and women. The League is strictly nonpartisan. We do not support parties or candidates. Rather, our mission is to educate and empower voters to participate in the democratic process. We support fair districting maps and equal and equitable education for all our citizens. A valuable service provided by the League's Education Fund is vote411.org, a Webby award-winning website that functions as a one-stop shop for election information. Customized voter information, including election dates and poll locations, registration status, voter registration forms, candidate data, and absentee ballot information, along with many other resources, can be found at this site.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The truth is marching on. Arise in your Christ. March to the watchman's justice and Christ. He's awake, awake. God, your legions fight on. Song of the fathers, custom of Mary, come from the
Well, thank you, Reagan Aduddle. That was quite something. Thank you also to all of your collaborators with League of Women Voters, Charles and Mary Love, and everybody else. We have the folks you've met already. Hannah Terrell from the library is back with us. Reagan Aduddle is here. And I'm going to ask Alex Paneras from Levine Museum of the New South, who's our IT wizard, see if you could bring Carolyn Lyons on. And she helped create this wonderful video, and then also Dr. Tom Cole, research librarian with Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. And we may have some questions for folks. I have a few questions as well. Someone says, I'm wondering if any veterans are watching. Women, minorities, other folks. Weigh in if you like. You can weigh in on any of the different chat platforms through Levine Museum of the New South. Or through the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. Someone says, my husband, 9-year-old daughter, and I are really enjoying this program. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. Weigh in, and we'll try and pass those along. I wanted to ask Reagan Aduddle if she had a favorite person or story that she encountered in all of this. Mm-hmm. And you're there we go. Mm-hmm.
I really like Sojourner Truth. I did not understand when I started how much the abolitionists and the suffragists were intertwined. And Sojourner Truth went around speaking about the evils of slavery and how important it was for women to be enfranchised. And she was born a slave and made her money by selling her pictures. she then realized other people were copying this. So she was the first person to copyright her own image in the United States. So she was born a slave, but died the first person to own her own image. And so I just thought, oh, you know, the entrepreneurship, the what she went through. So I really admired her.
Episode in all of this? Carolyn Lyons or Hannah Terrell, did you have a favorite person or episode in all of this? Kind of wiggle your hand and we'll unmute you. Carolyn, anybody that came to mind for you?
Instead of an actual person, I think the story that I found the most interesting, when we started researching this project last November, I came across a lot of information about how important the Spanish flu had been in the women's suffrage movement. And I remember we had a lot of discussions about that. And little did we know that the next giant pandemic was on its way already and would be influencing this year's presidential election, just as it influenced the elections back in the early part of the 20th century.
Somebody? Let's see if we can get Hannah unmuted. There we go.
Yes. I agree with Reagan and Carolyn in what they, the stories that they brought to light. And I also want to say it was always fascinating how that the Delta sorority was founded out of this movement too. So they rallied around this, you know, wanting their voices to be heard, not wanting to be in the back of the line, and demanding to have a space. So, and that's what they rallied around, and still is very well and alive today. So I thought that was always very interesting.
Well, thank you.
We were so excited to find out that they got to be in the front of the line at the anniversary march. And we knew we had to put that in.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Tom Cole is at the Carolina room of the public library. And let me kind of ask you, put you on the spot and see if there is someone out of Charlotte's history that you would want to bring up, or just say something a little bit about what folks can find on their own at the Carolina room.
Well, I will just say that the float showing the seven women and the banner saying "Votes for Women." Well, that was for Charlotte, as you mentioned earlier, that in May of 1914, that Charlotte women organized first and held a convention later that year for the Equal Suffrage League. So North Carolina was a little slow getting on board, but once on board, Charlotte led the way in the early year, in the first year or so. There are some notable women. Our website is cmstory.org, and we try to tell, as the title indicates, the Charlotte Mecklenburg story. And there are some notable women in there. Among them, Julia Alexander, who ran for mayor, and I believe briefly served in the state legislature in the 1920s. And her kinswoman, I'm not sure exactly how she was related, but Annie Alexander, who was the first woman to get an ND in the state of North Carolina and served here for many years. And you can see a historic marker honoring her where her house used to be and her office on North Tryon Street. And but just generally, the CM Story site is a good place to browse and to look for browse through some of our exhibits to see some of our deep dives into parts of Charlotte Mecklenburg history we've been able to eliminate using the things in the holdings in our collection. But the most valuable part of the CM Story website is the one that says "Contact Us." So click on that anytime. The librarians are on duty most days of the week, ready to respond to your questions, even though our room isn't open to the public yet, I'm sorry to say. We look forward to that. But in the meantime, submit any questions about Carolina history, or really our specialty in the room, genealogy as well. We'll take questions that way, and we'll do the best answer we can using the resources at our disposal, which are pretty tremendous. Someday they'll be at your disposal too when you can come back to the library.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for all the libraries doing to promote this history throughout these many months. A national book that I just finished reading, someone else here finished it as well. A person says, I just finished Jill Lepore's The Secret Life of Wonder Woman. Now, Wonder Woman is a TV character, a comic book character who I didn't take very seriously. I don't take hardly any comic book characters seriously. And Jill Lepore is the amazing historian who writes almost every month for the New Yorker. She's a Harvard professor. And The Secret Life of Wonder Woman turns out to have been very much tied up in suffrage movement activists, birth control activists. And so The Secret Life of Wonder Woman, I would recommend that. 2 local books that I would recommend that you can get through the Charlotte Library. I believe there are check-outable copies. There's also copies at the Carolina Room that you can read when you're able to go back there. One is called Bittersweet Legacy. It's by a woman named Jeanette Greenwood, and it's about that era right before the suffrage amendment when African Americans and whites were arguing over things like prohibition, suffrage. How do you put together a coalition that tips the balance? And so Bittersweet Legacy will tell you a lot about race relations in Charlotte, as well as about men and women in what they called the better classes, the folks who are very well-educated, very civically active. Another book is by Mary Kratt, K-R-A-T-T, Charlotte historian. She wrote an entire book of histories of Charlotte women called New South Women. And getting a hold of that is something I would very much recommend. How can we get involved with the League of Women Voters of Charlotte, asks someone. How about one of our League folks answering that?
Well, we would love to have you join, and you can go to our website, which is goleaguego.org, and join. We have we'd love to have both men and women. Someone once told us we should now be the League of Educated Voters, or progress our name forward. But we would love to have you join there. And we have lots of different activities and different committees people are working on: voting, gerrymandering, equitable education. So we would love to have you come on board. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've got a couple more questions. We're going to be running out of time here in another 3 minutes, but I want to work in, a question, is there a league in Greensboro? Yes, I think that there is.
Yes, I believe there is. That would be the League of Women Voters, Guilford County.
Cool. All right. So be watching for that. And a question that's going to be hard to grapple with, but since the 1965 Voting Rights Act has been amended by Congress, by the Supreme Court rather, a question from one of our elected officials, actually. Without further action from the federal government on voting rights, how can citizens engage now at the state and local level to protect and extend voting rights activists? Voting rights access. What's the best way to help people get to the polls, make sure that people can get to the polls? How can we extend voting rights and access?
I think one of the services that the video spoke about that the National League sponsors, the Vote 411 website, is a fantastic resource that everybody who has access to the internet can use to educate themselves about their current situation, where they vote, how they absentee vote if they choose to, information on the candidates. That is a wonderful, and as the video mentioned, award-winning website.
And I do a lot working with voting, and I think that getting community groups together to help people understand their voting status. Are they registered to vote? Can you get registered to vote? Where do you go? Getting your community together to learn early voting sites, to learn how to engage. You can vote. You just need to own your voting status. Own your vote. It's difficult. We're working at it. The league is working at it. There are other organizations that are working to help people right now understand how to vote. Can you vote?
And even in a quote unquote normal year without a pandemic, there has been consistent research that shows that when you make a plan, a voting plan, it significantly increases the likelihood that you will actually carry through and vote. So you can't really just wing it. Certainly not this election cycle. You've got to come up with a plan, make sure that you meet all the deadlines, check all the boxes, get everything done right. And Vote 411 is a wonderful resource to help you do that.
And I also too want to add too that as far as the library is concerned, as Tom Cole said, we may be having limited access because of the phases that we're in because of COVID-19, but you can still call us. And we can still walk you through if you don't have a computer at home, or if you don't know how to search, or if you don't know where your voting polls are, please give us a call. We have 20 locations all over the county. Call our numbers and ask to speak to any one of our librarians, and we can walk you through and find out, get you to the websites that Carolyn is telling, find out information that you need. We are here for all of our citizens.
And we will
really appreciate the library giving it space for the voting over many, many years.
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Yeah, I said that if you have an organization or something that you want help with registration, you can always contact the league, because we were very happy to come out and educate people, help people get enfranchised, get ready to vote.
If you're just joining us now, the League of Women Voters takes no position on any of the issues or any of the parties. They just want people out there voting. Question, does the league track current stats and trends of women who vote? How is women's turnout as strong as men's? Stronger? Do you have any statistics in that regard?
Women are more likely to vote than men as a group.
In general, I don't know that we have specific statistics, but women are more likely to vote.
Yeah, not the league, but just research in voting behavior shows that women are more reliable voters than men.
Once we got the hang of it, we're gangbusters.
We don't take it for granted now.
No.
Wonderful. Well, it's coming up on 10 after 8, and that's when we promised that we would turn the airwaves back over to other folks. Really appreciate Reagan Aduddle and Carolyn Lyons from League of Women Voters, Hannah Terrell and Thomas Cole from the Public Library, as well as the folks behind the scenes, including Martha Yesowich at the Public Library, and Alex Paneras and Eric Scott, Braxton Winston, folks who have put together the New South for the New Southerner programs, and particularly Courtney, the public relations person at Charlotte, at Levine Museum of the New South, who's helped get the word out. Eat some food at Mertz. Mertz Heart and Soul, they're open for takeout. I know that for sure downtown. Great cornbread. Give money to the Arts and Science Council. They're part of what keep the lights on here. Also, thank you so much to the North Carolina Humanities Council and all of the folks who have been helping with the New South for the New Southerner series. Going to check in and see if anybody has any last words that I've missed. All right. Good evening. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Remember to vote.
Yes, vote.
Right. Go vote.